Jay Burney, and I'm here with John Whitney. John, it's good to see you. This is part of our Staying Connected series. It's also part of our Western New York Environmental Alliance series, and I think this is going to be part of the Garden Walk Buffalo series also. And it really is great to see you. And what's going on? How are you doing? How are you enduring this COVID crisis? I guess that's a good starting question.
It is a good starting question. Enjoying is probably not the right word, but we're tolerating the COVID pandemic and pause reasonably well. I am continuing to work from home part-time, and I get out almost every day and wander around the woods or the swamps or sometimes along the streams. I wish we could get near and in a little more water. That's not a good option for us right now, but we're doing okay. And the gardens are growing well. The heat is starting to wear me down just a little bit, but we'll make it through that too.
On this day, which is July 7th, 2020, it's really hot outside. The air temperature is about 96. Humidity is really high. I've been lucky to get outside. I actually went kayaking on the Niagara River over the weekend, which was a wonderful experience. But it's good to get outside. And John, you and I have known each other for quite a long time, at least 20 years. And currently, I think we're serving on the Western New York Environmental Alliance board together. I think you're the vice chair. I'm the advocacy chair. And this is an important thing for our organization to start to get to know our boards of directors, members, and the work that they're doing. And so today, I think we're going to be talking, I keep saying I think we're going to, I know we're going to be talking about soils. And why don't you introduce it? Tell us, what is it we're talking about today?
Sure. Well, I come to the topic after a nearly 40-year career with the United States Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Actually, for much of that time, well, until 1991, it was actually called the Soil Conservation Service. So soil was baked into the name of the agency, and soil is what we talked about. And in some respects, the name change from the Soil Conservation Service to the Natural Resources Conservation Service recognizes that soil is the great integrator. It's not just about soil, it's the interactions of soil and atmosphere and soil and climate and soil and plants and animals that live in and on and make up the soil as well. So lots of us think of soil in a variety of different ways. It can be what has gotten our clothes dirty. It could be the substrate for building on. For me and the Department of Agriculture, and for gardeners and ecologists and folks who look at soil from that perspective, so soil is a growth media, but it also is part of a natural ecosystem. And again, the integrator of water, air, and what's below that, and the things that grow in and on the soil.
Well, as a conservationist that does a lot of installations of native plant and pollinator areas, I know how important soil is and how hard it is to find good soil, and sometimes how you have to make your own soil, whether that's through composting or some other means. But if you're a gardener, you're an urban gardener, how important is having the right kind of soil, and how do you make sure that you have the right kind of soil?
Well, many urban soils have been highly modified already. And if we're thinking specifically about the Buffalo urban soils, they've been modified from use and building and from contamination with lead paint and auto exhausts and industrial deposits that have come in through the atmosphere. Good soil is always a relative term. It's also important, I think, to step back and say, well, what kind of basic soils are there in Buffalo? And most of the soils in Buffalo are soils that are of a lacustrine origin, meaning they are soils that are derived from deposits that occurred within a lake, Glacial Lake Iroquois, 10 to 12,000 years ago or so, when the area was covered with a lake and the glaciers retreated, but the lake still covered a lot of that area. And as the lake receded, those bottom sediments, those lacustrine sediments, became the soils that cover most of what Buffalo is built on and in, and what people are trying to garden and grow in. Again, although it's highly modified. In fact, there's a term that I like to share, it's a fancy term, but it's kind of an interesting term, anthropogenic, meaning human made or human modified. And most of the buffalo soils are human modified to some extent. They tend to be, people think of them as clay, and many lake deposits do have high percentages of clay, but they still are often silt loam with, on the clayey end of silt loam soils, meaning they have a mix of silts and sands and clay-sized particles. Clays being the smallest, silt being mid-size, and sands being a little bit bigger. There are a few areas of other types of deposits in Buffalo, but most of them are lacustrine, silty clay loams or silt loams. And they start out being fairly good soils, not great soils, but fairly good until we mess them up and we compact them and we dig them out and we replace them with all kinds of rubble. So when people are looking at their soils on their property, really they need to start with, what do I have there now? And does it need improvement, or is it okay? How much modification is going to be needed?
So I guess it's fair to say that evolution has a big role in how soils are created and what the right kinds of soils are. And if we look at evolution here, as you pointed out, this was once a lake bed. And so what came after the lake bed, the kind of native plants that grew here, aren't necessarily the kinds of plants that people are growing in their urban gardens today. And there's two kinds of gardens, at least. I mean, there's food gardens and there's flower gardens. And so finding the right soils for those kinds of things are really important. I think I'd like to talk more about flower gardens now. How do you determine what's the right kind of soil, the condition of the soil, and how do you keep it healthy?
Many soil scientists and gardeners and farmers actually have a technique that they're fond of using, which is to grab a little handful of soil and start working it around, and by feel, helping to determine what the texture of the soil is, what its structure is like. Is it holding together well, or is it just a clod that doesn't break apart? How dry is it? Is it holding moisture well? Many of our soils, especially urban anthropogenic soils, need more than anything else organic matter. And decaying organic matter, or organic matter actually being part of the soil. Our mineral soils around here typically have somewhere in the range of 2 to at the most 5% organic matter. If you push the organic matter up higher, you automatically increase water holding capacity, nutrient availability, and soil structure that's good for plant roots, whether they're flowers or pollinator plants or landscaping plants or vegetable crops. So determining can be based a little bit based on soil mapping and some of that work that's been done over the years with the Erie County Soil Survey and other mapping tools. But knowing what you have on your own property really does mean you get in the soil and you dig around.
I'm really glad you brought up the term organic matter in soils. I mean, you can consider soil a living organism, and those organic materials, including living things like microorganisms, I suspect are really important. Am I correct?
You're correct, and our understanding of the importance of microorganisms in recent years is really expanding too. Soil is not an inert material. A healthy soil is full of living organisms, and it's that diversity of living organisms that maximizes soil health, that produces the glues that help create good soil structure and to bind the soil particles together. So a clayey soil without good organic matter in it becomes brick. A clayey soil like we have around here with good organic matter in it still remains friable and reasonably farmable, a decent garden soil, but it needs that organic matter pushed as far as you can push it reasonably. And some people actually go well beyond that and try to grow in organic, non-natural soil mixes. That's certainly an option and even sometimes appropriate for certain crops. I feel, both based on my background and my current employment, which is with the Cornell Cooperative Extension in Erie County, part-time, it's important to say that many of our soils are contaminated to the level that it is not always appropriate to grow vegetable crops for human consumption in them without some mitigation techniques or raised beds with artificial soil.
I know that in the work that I do, which is basically native plants and native ecosystems, the soil is part of an ecosystem. Everything that lives in that soil is part of an ecosystem. Sometimes it gets invaded, often it gets invaded by plants or animals that shouldn't be there. And those are problems we have to learn to deal with. But if we're growing a garden, understanding that whole ecosystem is so important. And there's two questions I have to you. How do you make a good soil? And I'm assuming that we all should be thinking about making our good soil. And what impact does things like using chemicals, herbicides, and pesticides in that soil contributes to the contamination, I would assume?
Agriculture at the commercial scale certainly still uses agricultural chemicals in ways that can be harmful, but with very good management techniques that many farms try hard to do with minimal contamination. That doesn't mean that there's not none. And certainly there are farms that are completely organic without commercial pesticide uses and without inorganic fertilizer uses. And then the other scale that, again, with integrated pest management and other tools, can produce good crops and relatively safely with minimal environmental impacts. We do know that without good management techniques, those impacts can impact the environment in serious ways. And we live along Lake Erie, and we know the western basin of Lake Erie is suffering from excessive nutrient loads, at least in significant part from agricultural runoff. So at that scale, at the watershed scale, that soils, again, as the integrator, can be overwhelmed by contributions. And that can even happen at the garden scale, at the individual yard scale. Some people over-fertilize, and over-fertilizing means water with nutrients is going to run off the property or leach into the groundwater. In our tighter soils, runoff tends to be a bigger issue than leaching into groundwater. But over-fertilizing is possible. Misapplication of pesticides can certainly be an issue, and one wonders how necessary that is in an urban environment. My lawn doesn't get any pesticide application. It hasn't needed to for 34 years. And it's got nice clover. It's got a nice mix of things. It's still grass, still has to be mowed. It still grows, doesn't stay at a lawn scale, but the gardens are the same way. Every now and then I have fertilized a bit, but I watch that closely. And ideally, one of the things that people can do is test their soil to know whether it's at the proper pH, to know whether it is whether it has the right balance of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium for ideal crop growth. So that testing of the soil can happen by sending the tests off to the lab or samples off to the lab. It can happen at least at the pH level in many years by bringing samples to the master gardeners that Cornell Cooperative Extension helps to support and coordinate. This year with COVID-19, some of that option is off the table. There are kits that are available people can use to test their soil as well. They tend not to be perfect, but they can be good indicators of where fertility is at. A lot of times people just over-fertilize though. And
you mentioned the term integrated pest management, IPM. If you want to know what that is, you can Google it. IPM, it's a well-known approach to designing, using the right kinds of chemicals and the right schedules. You know, John, we're getting close to the end of the thing here. One thing that really interests me, something that I always think about, we do have the lake soils originally. Then we've had forests and other sorts of organic soils that have been created over, I'm not going to say the millennia, but since Lake Iroquois vanished. How important is it and how easy is it to make soils that work for our gardens?
One common soil description for how to make soil is get a big container and throw in about 45% of sand and silt and clay and maybe 3 to 5% organic matter and about 25% water and also 25% air, because pore space is filled with air in a good soil. Shake it up and let it sit out in the environment for 300 to 500 years, because it takes 300 to 500 years to form an inch of soil in our environment. So that's the natural process, the natural soil evolution. If you're going to modify soil yourself, you can go to the garden store and you can buy bags of, you can buy bags of garden soil, empty the bag, grow in it. That can work perfectly fine. You can use your on-site, your in-situ soil, and modify that by bringing in some more organic matter, composted manure, other compost, organic matter, peat moss, sphagnum moss, those kind of soil additives that can improve your on-site natural soil. One thing that people have to be a little careful about is you can actually add undecomposed compost at too high a level, or undecomposed organic matter at too high a level, with the result that the nutrients are tied up with an unfavorable carbon nitrogen ratio. Too much carbon, the microbes suck up all that nitrogen and none of it's available to the plants, or very little of it's available to the plants they're trying to grow in it. So there's a little bit of give and take in trying to modify a soil too fast, and in ways that don't give the organisms in the soil time to release nutrients and create good soil structure and characteristics.
So Cornell Cooperative Extension, is that a good resource? People can go look it up, find information about gardening and soil?
Well, yes, I certainly think so. One resource that I think has been really interesting this year in the COVID-19 pause and slow recovery here in New York is Cooperative Extension's Master Gardeners have moved to an online-based consulting process, and so they're doing multiple times a week over the garden fence chats. So people can go to the Cornell Cooperative Extension Erie Facebook page or the Cornell Cooperative Extension Erie webpage and find how to participate in those garden fence chats, get your questions answered. They often have topics that are tied to a particular day, but people can call in, listen in on Facebook Live sessions and Zoom sessions, and try to address some of those questions that come up related to soils and gardening and native plant production and growth, and also the kind of gardening that people are doing for human consumption.
Hey, John, we're about out of time, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us today to talk about these things. So thanks. Anything you want to add before we go off the air?
Well, I do. One of the favorite things that I like to do is let people know about a web-based application called Soil Web. And what's interesting about Soil Web is on your phone, you can download the little app and you get your phone out. And of course, our screens are not going to show it really well, but on the Soil Web app, you can press the button that says Get Soil Data, and the Soil Web app will check the published soil maps and tell you what the soil is mapped at the spot that you're standing at. And I think that's just phenomenal. And it works all across the country. It's not perfectly 100% accurate because soils are a little more complex than that. But based on the soil surveys and the mapping and the parent material at the site, I know, for example, that my house was built into a soil that's predominantly ore park. Ore park is short for orchard park. And once you know that, you know what the basic characteristics of that original plant material, that original parent material and soils happen to be. And that can help guide your management decisions and even what plants might be best suited for that site.
How do you find Soil Web? You
look on whatever your phone's app source might be for Soil Web.
Just Google Soil Web.
Well, if it's on your phone, you're going to go to your app store.
Yeah, okay. Oh, so it's an app called Soil Web.
It's an app called Soil Web. Yep.
Great.
So
Right.
I think, again, that's a cool thing. I introduced that to a farmer who managed to get away for a few days from his dairy farm, and he put it on his phone, and he said he checked his soils from here to Florida with his Soil Web app. So to me, that was really cool, and people might find that to be fun.
Hey, John, thank you.
You're welcome, Jay. Thanks for visiting with me.
Look forward to talking to you again. See you at the next Western New York Environmental Alliance board meeting.